we're good to go. Yeah. We're having a hard time finding him. Well, it appears he's not.
All right, well, we'll get started without him. So for those of you watching at home, we're still waiting for Mr. Beckett, but we will go ahead. Our building is not the easiest thing to get into if you don't have the right cards. So, I'll call us to order. I think I should probably start with a roll call. So we'll start. I'm here. Councillor Walters.
Gleefully here.
Councillor Banga.
All ready for the restart.
I see you there. Councillor Hamilton.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor McKean.
Morning, Mr.
There
Chair.
you are. I can see you. Councillor Paquette.
Good morning.
And I'm just wondering if there's anybody else here from council. We scared them all off. I'm not seeing any. Am I missing somebody? Right, then it's just the happy six of us. Good. All right. So adoption of the agenda. Somebody would like to move that?
Happy to.
Oh, sorry.
That was Councillor McKean, I think. So shall we use our voting devices to make sure they work?
Yes, please.
Please vote.
Councillor Henderson? No, Councillor Henderson, I just had a question on that.
Yeah? Oh, sorry, I misunderstood. Okay, we'll hold the vote. Yep. Go ahead.
No, I had a question on the agenda.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay. Do we, and maybe you're going to deal with this in a minute, this is the awkwardness of not being in the room. Are we dealing with 610 before 69?
I asked that question. I think we need to, quite frankly. There's part of 6.9, but we don't have the waste people in the room at this point, so we can ask them that later. But that would be my instinct is passing 6.9 before we discuss 6.10, because half of it applies to 6.10 would be inappropriate. So,
Yes.
but I suggest
Okay,
we
we can deal with that then.
I think we deal with that later. We actually may be able to hear them together. So, and it might be the other solution is actually cross-referencing. Actually, let's wait and do a double check with the waste folk when they're here, which Lord knows maybe in a couple of weeks. So, okay, thanks. Good call though. Anything else on the agenda?
Councillor, it's Gord Sebrick. Your comments on the waste would be acceptable, whichever way council or committee chooses to go.
So, Mr. Sebrick, does it make sense to hear them both together?
Yes, it would.
Okay, then I think, Councillor Walters, if you want to propose that as an amendment to the agenda, that would be great.
Okay, I'll move that we essentially reverse the order of 6.9 and 6.10.
Well, or hear them at the same time, or cross-reference. Cross-reference.
Or we can cross-reference them. So
we'll cross-reference
I'll move
them.
that we
Good.
cross-reference
Okay,
this.
I will take that as a friendly amendment. Does anybody have trouble with that?
Friendly
right.
to the mover.
Good. Then anything else? Any other concerns about the agenda?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure that the additions to the agenda have been mentioned here.
Right. Sorry. So I think Councillor Walters, you were moving the agenda? So
no, Councillor McKean did.
Councillor McKean, is it? I'm seeing there's additions 6.1, 6.5, and 6.8. Was that your intention in your motion?
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks. Then there we go. Any other questions about the agenda with those three additions added and the cross-referencing of 6.9 and 6.10? Hearing none, please vote.
And we have all the votes, Mr. Chair.
Please display the vote. And that has passed. Approval of minutes from our last meeting way back in April.
I can move those, that we approve the April 30th, 2021 Utility Committee meeting minutes.
Any concern about the minutes? Hearing none, please vote.
We're good to go.
Please display the vote. And that is passed. Are there any protocol items? Hearing none, then select items for debate. Stony silence, are we done?
Yeah. Well, that would be great. I can go. And I don't need to go first on all these.
No, understood.
In fact, I shouldn't, but I'll select them. 6-1,
Yep,
I think I don't have a lot of questions, but I think the presentation would be valuable. 6-2,
yep,
6-3, 6-4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8, and 6, 9, and 10. That's all I need.
Okay, anything else? That leaves 2 items, 3
Yeah,
including the,
Six. Oh, sorry, it's Councillor Paquette.
yep,
9-1.
yep, thanks. Good, so that leaves the 1 revised due date and the non-regulated loan repayment, which actually we have already debated in council. We've dealt with that at council already, so I'm not entirely convinced we need to have it here, but that's okay. It's better safe than sorry. Good, all right. If somebody would like to move anything else, then if somebody would like to move other items, that would be great.
So moved.
Councillor Hamilton, any further discussion? Please vote.
And we have all the votes.
And display the vote, please. And that has passed. Request to speak. We do have quite a few. Is there anybody that has the list in front of them that can put that in?
Where would we find the list? I don't have it, but
Okay, it's on the summary of agenda changes page at the bottom, second item. But I can do
Mr.
it if
I
that's
have the-
useful. I can do it if it's helpful.
Mr. I have,
Okay, go for it. Yep.
okay, I move that the committee hear from the following speakers on item 6.8, EPR PBR application, Cheryl Lorenz, and number 2 is Maria Samyi. On 6.9, waste services supplemental capital budget adjustment, Donna Monkhouse, Christopher Bettdorf. And on 6.10, multi-unit strategy, Donna Monkhouse, Christopher Bettdorf, Cam Antiak, Chris Labossiere.
Great. And since we've
Mr.
now,
Chair- oh, sorry, Mr.
Since-
Chair, also, the 2 first speakers, Cheryl Lawrence and
are
Maria
on
Sanjay.
all the items,
Yes,
correct? So
correct.
they're on
6.3 to
6.3.
6.8.
Do you want to speak on the items 6.3 to 6.8 that are all cross-referenced? And,
Yes.
correct? And I assume that's your intention in your motion, Councillor Banga. And then we've now cross-referenced 6.9 and 6.10. So again, it really is, both of the speakers on 6.9 were also registered for 6.10, so it's really just the 4 of them that we'll hear from on those items. Is that your intent?
That is correct.
Great, good. Any discussion? Seeing none, please vote.
And we have all the votes.
And display the vote, please. And that is passed. I'm not seeing any further time specifics. I think we're just scheduled to do these in the order that they're coming up. which I think is probably the best sense and makes the most sense in terms of order. Any councillor inquiries? Good. Then I think that brings us to our first item, which is 6.1. And welcome, Mr. Beckett. Glad we could get you into the building. So, do we have a presentation on 6.1?
So for item 6.1, Epcor does have a presentation that they wanted to give
Great.
on the progress report.
Perfect. Yeah, well, I think if you can come, you'll need to come down, probably best to come down to somewhere where there's a mic and a, I don't know, Mr. Clerk, what would you prefer?
As long as we don't have more than 3 people at the table behind me, we're
Perfect.
good.
Okay.
Yeah, and the seats up there also have microphones.
Mics, those ones do,
Yeah.
those ones don't. Great. Okay.
Did you want the slides, or should you just?
I think, well, they're showing up on this, on the screen, am I correct? So actually, they may actually be, let me just check. Yes, they're visible to, they are visible to everybody who's watching on, online. We just don't have them. So I think we're fine, as long as you can see them and know where you're at.
And
I
we'll
think
send out the presentation to
Okay.
all the
Councillor
members.
Henderson, we're happy to give the presentation. If you would prefer we just go straight to questions, we're happy to do that as well.
I would appreciate presentations today, if only we, if my experience has been like anybody else's, there's so much information coming at us, it's very hard to remember all the things that are in all the reports. So I think as a kind of refresher on each of these, even an overall summary and survey would be helpful today.
Okay, I will keep the comments brief and just hit the highlights. So this is the 2020 PBR Progress Report. As I'm sure everyone appreciates, this is the annual report that we provide to Utility Committee that looks at the financial and operational performance of water, wastewater, and drainage for the calendar year, and this one is 2020. Next slide, please. Starting with customers and consumption, in 2020, customer counts were 0.4% higher than forecast, and that's due to growth in the residential customer class over our original projection. But obviously, there's been quite a drastic change in consumption given the situation with COVID. Overall consumption is 5.3% less than forecast, and you can see on the individual line items, residential is up 6.1%, and commercial is down 25%. And we see this as simply a function of people working at home and not in the office, and so there's quite a drastic swing in it. But the overall consumption is down 5.3%. Next slide, please. Looking at in-city water, and we use the term in-city water because our system is provides water to the regional water customer groups, which is beyond the city, and so there is in our cost of service model a subdivision between those customer classes, and so this is just the ratepayers within the city of Edmonton. Revenues were 10.3 million less than forecast, of which 5.4 million resulted from lower inflation, 4.5 million from the forecast consumption differences, and $500,000 relates to the negative non-routine adjustment where we spread our corporate costs over a larger base with the transfer of the drainage business at the beginning of the PBR term. Operating expenses were $10.1 million less than forecast. That's driven by a number of factors: lower forecast power costs, lower corporate shared service costs that also impact the revenue side. But one of the most significant challenges we're having is chemical costs. We were $2.7 million above our forecast in 2020 and 8.8 year-to-date in this PBR term. And that's strictly driven by the turbidity and unfavorable conditions in the raw water. The net result of this is in-city water earned an ROE of 10.09% in 2020, which is 0.85 less than our target of 0.175. Next slide, please. When you look at the capital expenditures, we typically look at this on the entire term basis, so this is 27 to 21. And just to note, these are later projections than you would see in the PBR, so they're slightly different than the PBR, but generally they align, but they do reflect that projects have advanced since the PBR was developed. So in 2017 to 2021, capital expenditures are projected to exceed the PBR forecast by $61.4 million. And that's due to quite a number of items, but certainly the large ones would be the E.L. Smith Solar Farm, the network PD transmission mains, and just for reference, what this is where we pay for transmission or distribution mains by developers, and we really have no visibility into what they're doing, so we do our best to estimate that, but this time it tends to be quite a bit over. Obsolete valve replacement programs, 9.3, and water service connections at 10.0. Those are offset by the deferral of the deep bed filter project, which is a $22 million reduction, and a decrease in water meter changeouts, which is a further reduction of 12.8. So again, we're on track to exceed our original forecast by 61.4, but that also includes the non-routine adjustments. Next slide, please. Turning to wastewater, in terms of revenue, expenses, and net income. In 2020, wastewater revenues were $7.2 million less than forecast, of which 2.5 is related to forecast inflation, $3 million for lower consumption, and 1.1 attributable to the negative non-routine adjustment. Operating costs were 5.7 less than forecast, primarily driven by additional staff working on capital projects. And overall, we earned an ROE of 10.7% versus the target of 10.175. Next slide, please. On the capital side, wastewater capital expenditures are projected to exceed the forecast of $12.9 million. And there's quite a number of reprioritizations within the project, and we see that as one of the benefits of the PBR. It gives us some flexibility to adjust spending on projects. So there's $10.8 million to construct the above-ground pipe network, $12.5 million to upgrade and replace sludge lines, and you may recall we did bring a business case on that forward a year or so ago, and $5.3 million to replace clarifier change. And then that was offset by a deferral of $10.6 million for the digester 4 upgrade, as well as reprioritization of reliability and life cycle replacements. Next slide, please. Turning to drainage. Drainage rates revenues were $6.5 million, greater than budget, and that's primarily driven by the non-routine adjustments for SERP, CORE, and LRT. If you normalize for those, we're actually below forecast because of changes in consumption. Drainage operating expenses were $3.8 million greater than budget, primarily due to the SERP and CORE NRAs, higher project support costs. And this is an interesting one where when drainage was originally transferred from the city, these costs were in the capital side, And under our accounting rules, they now have to be classified as operational expenses. And so it's something that we didn't build into the budget, but those equate to probably $10 million a year. That's partially offset by lower biosolids processing costs, lower maintenance, as well as monitoring and compliance costs being lower. This resulted in drainage earning an ROE of 4.95%, and it's slightly higher than its target of 3.25. Next slide, please. On the capital side, since we don't have a PBR for drainage, the basis that we look at our capital was the original capital plan, which was developed by the city and included in the Grant Thornton report. Based on that, capital expenditures are projected to be lower than the long-term forecast by $33.1 million. But there's quite a significant change in this, just as we reprioritize capital. So just a smattering of some of the things that have changed. $55 million below for environmental quality enhancements, $52 million below for drainage neighborhood renewals, but that's offset by $101 million additional expenditures for system rehabilitation and $47 for drainage expansion. There's also $39.4 million for LRT locates and the core NRAs in those numbers. Next slide, please. We also report on operational performance. These are the high-level categories. Underneath each of these indexes are 5 or 6 individual measures, but the expectation is that we achieve an overall score of 100 points. In city water, achieved 108 points in 2020, wastewater 110, and 104.7 in drainage. There are a few individual metrics below this where we didn't meet the target. Most of those were impacted by COVID and just the ability to do certain operational things if we had to be in people's homes or those types of things impacted the metrics. But overall, we've met the target. Next slide, please. And the next one, please. Looking at the residential water bill, in 2020, the average Edmonton bill was $39.90 for water, and that's very competitive with surrounding areas. There's only 3 that are lower, or even that's marginal. The only one that's significantly lower is Vancouver, and they have the advantage of a very good raw water supply, where ours unfortunately requires a lot more treatment. So this is generally where we come in, towards the bottom of the pack in terms of comparison to surrounding areas. And next slide, please. And in terms of wastewater, we tend to be slightly above the average. But just a point on this one is that wastewater bills are very difficult to compare because communities put various costs into wastewater, depends on the level of treatment. Certain services are included in property taxes. There's climatic changes, geographic changes, those types of things. But generally, we're mid-high, which is where we've been historically. And with that, I'm open for questions.
Thank you. Questions? I'm not seeing nobody on the list. Councillor Walters, you did select this, but I don't know if you had questions.
I just wanted that presentation, so thank you.
No, fair enough.
Cheryl.
Absolutely, I
Excellent.
appreciate it. I think you were absolutely right in selecting it. I do have some questions. Councillor McKean.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And I suspect you've dealt with this as utility committee in the past, but so turbidity caused more than $2 million in additional chemical costs, if I heard that right. And I just wonder how you account for that year over year, not knowing what the state of the water will be in the river. Some years less turbidity, other years more. How do you account for that financially?
Under the PBR system, Epcor bears the risk of that. And so we do our best to forecast chemicals based on normal weather patterns and those types of things. But ultimately, if we overspend in order to maintain the standard of the water quality, that risk is borne by Epcor.
Because the water quality standards themselves must be maintained.
That's correct. There's no room to move on that. We have to maintain the quality of the water. So irrespective of the quality of the raw water, we have to address it and pay whatever's necessary for chemicals in order to treat it.
So I see this as a bit analogous to our snow clearing budget. We can't predict ahead of time what the city of Edmonton is going to have to spend. And we have reserves to deal with that. But the PBR, and if I'm reading all the documents right, the PBR does not accommodate reserves. And your argument is to not have that sort of strategy within the PBR. Am I right?
I believe you are. The PBR is based on overall, and that's where we prefer to be judged, is the overall performance, financially as well as operationally. And if you go and look at individual components, there are some where we're required to overspend in order to maintain the standards of the water or provide service, and there's others where we underspend. But at the end of the day, that flexibility gives us the incentive to drive efficiency in the business. And then, of course, at the end of each term, we true those up, and any permanent savings are returned to the ratepayers.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Banga.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple questions in regards to operational performance. On slide 10, when you say index target and points earned, could you be able to tell me, I mean, in city water, the points earned, again, they are from the needed is 100, but we got 108. And what does, first of all, what do these points are earned refer to? And secondly, let's say, what would be the cost if they were both to remain on target? That's 100.
Well, there is no financial reward if Epcor exceeds the target. There are financial penalties if we don't exceed. And so we can, and there's a mathematical formula behind this, but we can pay a penalty of up to $1 million in water, $1 million in drainage, and $400,000 in wastewater treatment if we don't meet the targets. And then that would be reflected back to ratepayers in the annual rate increase. And so what the numbers refer to is under each of these indexes are a number of measures. And so just as an example, under system reliability and optimization index, we have the water main break factor, which is the number of water main breaks. We have a water loss factor. We have the water main break repair duration factor. So there's a number of sub-metrics. And there's a point system where we can earn bonus points if we exceed. And then you can also compensate if we happen to be under a particular metric and exceed on others. But overall, we have to achieve 100 points in order to avoid the penalty.
So, sorry, my neighbor started mowing his lawn there. But anyway, my next question is that 100 points, are they based on year-round performance, or when does Epcor get penalized if, like, how long the underperformance has to be?
We report on these annually, and so it's for the calendar year. And the process at the end of the year, we have an external audit firm come in, and they go through the data and make sure that the metrics are reported exactly as they should be. And those are the same people that audit the rate increases for the year. And when that's all done, it's passed on to the city manager for approval. And once we get the approval from the city manager, we then implement the rates for April 1st.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that if, let's say in the runoff, water runoff period, the quality of water is a bit different than what you have in normal times, I suppose. And is it so? This is basically an average of quality of water then.
That's right. It's over the course of a year. But you're right. Spring runoff is probably the most difficult time to treat the water.
Okay. So, so it could be below 100 at times, depending upon what time of the year it is.
Well, we may not be under 100 points, but certainly the individual metric would be below our target.
Okay, that's fair enough. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Banga. Okay, I have a few questions. My first one is, I'm curious about the lead mitigation strategy and how much of, because some of that's capital, some of that's operating, and how much of that, in terms of what we actually predicted in the NRA, was actually completed and how much is pushed forward?
Oh, I'm not sure I have that at hand. I know certainly the replacement of service lines was impacted.
Yeah, but that's a capital piece, so that gets trued up. It's the operating piece I'm a little bit more curious about.
Yeah, I'm sorry, maybe Audrey or Mark, if you could sign in and answer that for us, please.
Sorry, Councillor, I'm just trying to scramble and get those numbers. Can I get back to you on answers?
Sure.
For that
It really, in some ways, it's. I'm just wondering because I know what our intentions were, and I do recognize in here that COVID had an impact on that. So, but again, I think it probably is more a look forward question that I need to have answered. So that's fine. If you can get back to me, that'd be perfect.
And of course, there is multiple components because there's the orthophosphate system in addition to
No, understood.
the replacement.
But did we get the orthophosphates going, for instance? And did we meet? And I can't remember if our intention was to get the orthophosphates going in this cycle or in the next one.
Next.
It was in the next. Okay.
Going from memory, but that's what I
Yeah, I
recall.
just, this question's going to come up later, and that was one of the ones I flagged as things that, that we approved as NRAs in this one that now may show up in the next one. And on the capital side, I think that's less of a concern, but on the operating side, I think it raises some other questions.
I do have the numbers.
Sure.
I can speak to the numbers, and then maybe Mark can explain. But in terms of operating costs, we're about 800,000 underspent on the NRA, and then capital expenditures were $2 million overspent for an overall revenue requirement impact of negative 1.9.
Okay, so it's, okay.
Councillor Henderson, and that translates to approximately 70 high-priority lead services that were replaced within our 250 that were replaced in total. I'm not sure if that gives context or not.
Yeah, that raises an interesting question of how are we booking the ones that aren't ours? I'm guessing that's an operating expense and not a capital expense. Like if we're repairing, because we made a commitment to replace private pieces as well as our own pieces in that, and I mean, it's an interesting wrinkle. I'm guessing it's not a huge factor, but
Yeah, I don't know if it's material, but we can certainly look at that and get back to you.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, on page 10, I'm just trying to, sorry, this is the problem of having made notes days ago and thousands of pages ago. There's the combined effect of these, it's about the residential water, I think, use. And the combined effect of these factors is that total residential consumption for 2020 is 5.6 higher than forecast. I thought the stress that we were talking about here was that consumption was lower than predicted. So I just was a little bit puzzled by how those two things went together.
Well, there's certainly been a significant switch in consumption. I'm just flipping to that chart.
Yeah, sorry, and some of these questions I'm sure are answered in here.
Yeah.
There's so much information. I just wrote down questions as they popped in my mind.
So in 2020, residential was 6.1% above our forecast. Multi-res was 2.8% below, and then commercial was 25% below the forecast. And as I mentioned, we see a real switch of people moving to home has increased that level of demand. And overall, we're 5.3% below what we forecast.
Okay. And then my other questions I think we're going to deal with later, and you actually responded to in your response that I did read it, which is about the shift from operating to capital on and how that would be dealt with in the base. I think that might be. Sorry, this is an inefficient system. No, I think that's fine. Great, thanks. I think the other stuff will get captured as we move forward. Councillor Paquette, I saw you on, but you're off now, or did you have questions? Or?
Yeah, no surprise, you got to it before me.
All right. Okay, I think that's everything on this matter. If there's nothing else, then we can probably receive this information. Mr. Beckett, did you have any thoughts on this report?
No, thanks.
Okay, then if somebody would like to move receipt of this for information, I think it was really good to have as a kind of background to what we'll discuss later this afternoon.
So moved.
Councillor
go ahead.
Paquette moved that. I think I heard him first. So all in favor? Or please vote, sorry. Are we waiting for someone?
Have the ballots been sent, Landis?
Yeah, I voted.
Okay,
I voted.
okay. We have all the votes, thank you.
Great, thanks. And that has passed. Before we move on to the next item, for those people who signed up to speak online, particularly those on the waste item, welcome to keep on listening in. I don't know if you're there. If we get to this item today, it's going to be certainly well into the afternoon. So you're certainly welcome to stay here, but I wanted to try and give you some indication of when we get there. I suspect the PBRs are going to take a fair bit of time, and it's not out of the question we'll get to the waste items today, but it's possible we may have to we have an overflow of time in a couple of weeks if necessary to deal with those items if we don't get there today. For those who are wanting to speak to the PBRs, we have one other item first, which we will go to now, and I suspect this is administration giving this report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So good morning. When the drainage utility was transferred from the City of Edmonton to Epcor in 2017, there were terms and conditions in the letter of intent as part of the transfer. As a matter of due diligence, the City, with the support of Epcor, had Grant Thornton do an independent assessment to address the following three questions. Were the transfer elements as outlined in the letter of intent conducted as intended? Did the City and the ratepayer achieve the benefits outlined in the 2016 Epcor proposal for drainage transfer analysis? And are there any elements related to the transfer that are outstanding or need to be addressed further? So Grant Thornton concluded that Epcor has met its commitments and that the transfer substantially adhered to the guiding principles. Grant Thornton also identified additional areas for consideration that the city and Epcor are working towards together to address. The organizations are in agreement that these are areas that can be a future focus. So Grant Thornton does have a presentation or is here to answer questions if committee is interested. And Epcor also has a short presentation if so desired.
I think again, and I know time is of the essence here, but I think it's very helpful to have the presentations. It's a very
It's
tool
fair.
to remind
We
us
do
of
have
everything
Grant
that's in there.
Thornton available,
Yep.
and so if the clerks will work with the presentation, we're fine.
I would appreciate them. I don't know if anybody does anybody on the committee feel strongly about this in alternate? Great, then let's please have all the presentations.
Great. So hello, everyone. My name's Troy McDonald. I'm a partner with Grant Thornton in our Power and Utilities team. And just to sort of introduce this, this summarizes the work we did as the city's just laid out. And my colleague, Ricky Soni, is going to walk us through this material. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I was a project manager for the drainage transfer review. Can I go to the next slide, please? Perfect. So given that approximately 5 years has passed since the transfer, and Epcor is now submitting a new PBR, so the city engaged Grant Thornton to conduct this independent review, as just to take into account the terms and commitments included as Mary outlined in the letter of intent. And just to bring you back to that familiarity there, the letter of intent established a foundation of the transfer and was jointly developed by both the city and Epcor prior to the transfer occurring in September 2017. So given that much of our review included information requests and consultations, I'd like to just take a brief moment to acknowledge the efforts of both the city staff and Epcor to respond to our information requests. As Mary alluded to, on an overall basis, we concluded that Epcor has substantially adhered to the guiding principles documented in the letter of intent. As you can see on the screen, we used a bit of a green, yellow, and red approach when looking at the principles, with the green items reflecting the full achievement of the guiding principle, and items in yellow indicating that while Epcor appears to have achieved its commitment, that there are other issues or factors that should be considered or further monitored. The review of each of these principles is further documented in our report, and maybe for the purposes of today's discussion, I will just further expand on one of those principles, and that is the operational savings commitment under principle number 3. Can I go to the next slide, please? So within the letter of intent, a specific target for operational savings for the drainage utility was not specified, but in the 2016 Grant Thornton drainage proposal review, we suggested that a 5% operational efficiency target could be achieved within the first 5 years of transfer, and that's where we would be in 2022. And based on the approaches undertaken, this would result in about a $4.9 to a $5.9 million operational savings. Can I go to the next slide, please? So as noted in this table, there's two general approaches to determine the operational savings. Based on the adjusted 2022 forecast as shown on the left-hand side of this table, it's the left-hand column, Epcor is set to achieve a $4.5 million savings, which is slightly below the 5% operational efficiency target from the 2016 study. So nonetheless, because Epcor does appear to have achieved a degree of operational savings, we can conclude that they did satisfy the commitment as documented in the letter of intent. But based on our analysis, it does appear that there is potential for additional operational savings as well for the drainage utility in the future. So that's the overall conclusion on the operational savings. And as I noted, there's many more guiding principles in our report, but we'll go to the next slide as well. Thank you. As part of our scope of work, and as Mary mentioned, we did take some analysis on these 5 areas on the screen, since they did require some further resolution between the city and Epcor. And I'll just take a moment on the following slide to summarize the results on the quantification of some of these areas. Can I go to the next slide, please? So the intent of this table is to summarize our observations from the areas that may have a direct quantification to both ratepayers and taxpayers. So beginning first with wet ponds, we suggest that there is merit for Epcor to retain ownership of wet ponds and the associated land parcels, and to subsequently develop a service level agreement and a public access agreement in order for the city to maintain the green spaces which are associated with wet pond land parcels. That green space maintenance would continue to be funded by taxpayers. And as a result, this does not have a monetary impact on either taxpayers or ratepayers as compared to the status quo. However, the strong recommendation here is that it is suggested to further clarify and document the roles and responsibilities for each party to ensure that they can be operationalized successfully. With the second item, with respect to stormwater costs for the city of Edmonton, we suggest that there is merit for the city to pay stormwater costs for city-owned land parcels beginning in the next PBR term in 2025. This will limit cross-subsidization from other ratepayers and creates greater equity from similarly owned private land parcels. So based on the preliminary analysis using 2022 rates, this would result in an annual cost increase to the city or taxpayers and a resulting decrease to ratepayers of approximately $8 million. The third item there, our scope regarding contributed assets, focused on the catch basin repairs as part of neighborhood renewal projects. We concluded here that it is reasonable for Epcor to fund these capital costs. This is largely due for the older state of infrastructure as part of neighborhood renewal projects, regardless of whether the catch basins themselves are at or near the end of their useful life. Preliminary estimates suggest that this could be approximately $10 million a year, which are currently funded primarily by taxpayers, which ratepayers, if this recommendation is implemented, would ultimately fund. So just at a summary, the last row there suggests that at a high level, when you look at the cumulative impact of the quantification, this will result in an annual cost increase to ratepayers of approximately $2 million and a decrease to taxpayers of $2 million. So it's a net zero impact. Can I go to the next slide, please? So just briefly in this presentation to conclude, we like to say that Epcor has substantially adhered to the guiding principles documented in the letter of intent. However, we have noted some additional areas of consideration and other areas that the city can monitor in the future. Just one note here that we'd like to say is that given that both the city and Epcor are very large and complex organizations and have multiple touch points between the two, it is suggested that all the outstanding areas for resolution that we have reviewed would strongly benefit from clarity and direction provided by the city and Epcor. And that would certainly improve the operational impact as well. So this concludes a brief presentation, and of course, we're here to answer any questions for you.
Thank you very much. Questions? Or actually, I think we had other presentations, did we not? There was, Epcor wanted to respond, I think. Sorry, my error.
Sure, so we also have a presentation that's been submitted. Thank you. So we can go to the next slide, please. Going back to the 2017 Grant Thornton report, there was a projected large increase that was going to be required in rates, and in fact it was in excess of 20%, forecasted for the start of this PBR period, with an average annual increase of 12 to 14% projected to be required over the coming years. In the past 5 years, the capital spend has been rationalized to focus on the areas of highest risk, while recognizing the need to mitigate customer rate increases. This approach is continued in the PBR application, which we'll talk about in a little bit, reducing the increases that customers will see in the coming years. The increase forecasted by Grant Thornton in their 2017 report did not include the significant capital required for the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan. It didn't include funding for odor reduction, and because the condition of the assets that has been discovered as a result of gaining access to previously uninspected parts of the system through the corrosion and odor reduction strategy, the condition of those assets was not known at the time of the analysis, so no capital spend over and above historical levels was included in the forecast to address those issues. The rate increase presented in the PBR application that we're going to talk about today is significantly lower than what was forecasted and does include investment from both the SERP and the core programs. If we go to the next slide, the PBR application and the Reader's Guide includes explanations of how Epcor believes that the commitments made prior to the transfer have been met. There were a number of employee commitments that were made related to having no employee layoffs, honoring collective agreements, and improving safety performance. And those have all been met. We've spoken quite a bit about the commitments related to flood and odor, so I won't belabor those. Capital efficiencies have been far exceeded, and we believe that the operating efficiencies have also been met. I know the Grant Thornton report assessed the efficiency items submitted and thought that some items should not be included. So if you were to include all of them, you would conclude that the commitments have been exceeded. If you don't include the ones that Grant Thornton had suggested not be included, then the result is that the efficiency commitment is met in the first year of the PBR, so a little bit later than anticipated. Once you take into consideration the additional efficiencies that are built into the operating cost forecast within the PBR period. The dividend was increased, as you know, and the relationship with the city remains strong. We continue to coordinate development activities and participate in city initiatives, but the Grant Thornton report does include a recommendation to clarify roles and responsibilities related to planning, and we wholeheartedly agree with that recommendation. If we go to the next slide, there were a few things that we've learned since the time of the transfer, and those are rightly pointed out by Grant Thornton and some of the items that they just touched on. Prior to the transfer, we had anticipated that parcels of land that contain a stormwater management facility, which is also commonly referred to as a wet pond, would be subdivided. Most of these parcels contain a portion utilized for drainage purposes, and then a park with walking trails and benches contained above the high water mark. We had anticipated that the portion of the parcel containing the park would remain with the city, and the portion required for utility service would transfer to drainage. Through the transfer process, it was discovered that due to the irregular shape of the ponds themselves, it was not possible to subdivide the parcels in the way we had anticipated. At the time of the transfer, it was decided that the entire parcel would transfer to drainage, and the logistics around access and maintenance to the park would be documented through a service level agreement. But, we've had ongoing discussions with the city around some of the difficulties on that front. So, there's different approaches that we could take, and we certainly agree that, additional discussion with the city is required to determine whether the parcels get transferred back to the city and there's a service level agreement for Epcor, or whether they remain with Epcor and a service level agreement with the city. In addition, it has been identified that there are a number of contributed assets that require further discussion to determine whether some of them should be paid for through utility rates rather than the tax base. And the final item that I wanted to bring to your attention is that it relates to the treatment of billing and stormwater charges for city facilities. This item is complicated by the fact that the city has a wide variety in the type of land and buildings it owns, including large amounts of green space. So we'd like to do some work and figure out how other municipalities handle this in terms of stormwater billing, and see what makes sense in terms of how much the different types of properties contribute to stormwater runoff versus whether they might actually reduce stormwater runoff. And certainly, some of the work we've been doing with the city for low impact development on city property will impact that analysis. And those were the only comments that we had.
Great, thank you. Anything further for administration?
Not at this time.
Great, good. Then I think For simplicity's sake, Mr. Clerk, is it appropriate to allow people to ask questions of either Epcor or administration at this point?
I think we can do that, yes.
Okay, I'm going to suggest that that's the easiest way to move forward, although it's a little bit mushy in terms of our usual practice. So, Councillor Walters.
Yeah, thanks. And I just have a 2 or 3 questions here, mainly for Epcor. So you did note that the operational savings that Grant Thornton said are still sort of on the table. We're going to deal with those, and those are going to be noted in the conversation about the application, right? About in the PBR. You agree with that? Is what you're essentially saying? Is that there are further operational savings?
There are further operational savings, correct?
Okay. And we're going to explore what those are.
There's approximately.
Yeah.
Sorry, Councillor.
I was going to say through the efficiency factor and associated discussion within the PBR applications, which we're dealing with in a few minutes. So on the challenges with coordinating with the city on planning, maybe I wanted you to say a little bit more about that. Like, what are some specific examples, or the some of the more severe challenges? Just maybe offer a little bit more on that, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think the main issue, Councillor, is simply one of role clarity. We have occasions where there seems to be a little lack of clarity as to who's responsible for completing certain tasks, and it may result in a customer experience that's not entirely seamless if the customer gets told to go talk to Epcor, but then they have to go back to the city, or vice versa. And so, I think it's just one of these items that a little further documentation is probably required, just to make sure that everybody is both aligned and knowledgeable about the different roles and who performs different parts of the planning cycle.
Okay. So, and that probably gets even more difficult when other utilities are in the mix as well, I imagine. So, noting a specific example that's been a challenge in Grand Old Ward 10 lately. Okay, so thanks for noting that. So, what's your hope there? Is role clarity on the horizon? Is that being? You have a sense of when? I know there's rules related to road right away and transportation permits that are required for you guys to go in, and people don't know who they're supposed to call, so they end up calling us. Do you feel like that's progress is being made on that?
I do. We have very good working committees between Epcor and city representation, and I think the discussions are going on, and the discussions are going well, and there's really no animosity or anything between the groups, and so I think the discussions are progressing, and it's just something we need to continue.
Okay, and I think that is important because the citizens, residents having some sense of control over their public utility through good response and communication on issues that are needing to be resolved is sort of will determine ultimately the success of the in some ways contribute to people's perception of the success of the transfer. So I think continued work on that is really important. The last question is what are some of the types of contributed assets that are up for debate? Maybe say a little bit more about that piece as well. That's interesting to me.
Sure. I'll give you an example of neighborhood renewal. And what tends to happen is in a neighborhood renewal program, Epcor goes into the neighborhood the year before the city does their neighborhood renewal and inspects the assets and replaces anything that is in poor condition, and just to get it ready so that after the city's neighborhood renewal program, we're minimizing the need to dig up fresh pavement, if I can put it that way. We find that sometimes the city comes in the following year, and there are other assets that they may feel need to be replaced for a variety of reasons. And I think it's important to have further discussion to really understand what those different reasons are, why another asset might need to be replaced, and make sure that it's getting categorized correctly. If it's something due to road alignment, it might get one treatment, whereas if it's something that has had some damage and needs to be replaced, it might need a different treatment. And I think that's just one example. I think there are many examples, and I think it's another one where we just need further discussion between Epcor staff and city staff to ensure that we're treating all of these assets appropriately.
I got it. Okay, so Councilor Anderson, when the time's right, I can move the recommendation.
Great, I've got a few questions. You've asked some of them. I just, so maybe just quickly to Epcor then. So the contributed assets question is your larger thinking about the Grant Thornton catch basin issue?
Yeah, I think that's one example. I think there is a larger issue there.
There may be more that Grant Thornton didn't flag. Okay. I mean, I think that's an interesting discussion, and I guess, I have some, understanding a lot of this is future work. I guess I have some questions for administration. I mean, I think the wet ponds one, I'm assuming, probably makes sense, and it's, and we're probably comfortable with that as a thinking, but it'd be useful to hear your response. The stormwater costs, to us, it strikes me that that's the reverse of the situation we're doing with the fire piece, and I'm, it just crossed my mind. The timing doesn't really work. But in terms of not, seeing huge spikes in taxes, which may be hard to explain, although there'll be theoretically for most people a similar drop in their rates. But we're having the opposite problem right now with the fire. So I'm just wondering if those line up at all in terms of scale.
We have to wait for a bit. We've agreed with Epcor that it would go into the next PBR because there is further analysis for us to do.
Yeah.
And them for their buildings as well, so there's going to be a bit of a reckoning.
Yeah,
at that
it
point.
just, if we could have done them together, it strikes me that the spikes might have been avoided on both sides of the equation. That's all because they sort of do reverse themselves. But I suspect there's no way to do that from a timing point of view at this point.
Not, in my opinion, there is not. I forget your first one. The contributed assets is an interesting, we contributed about 34 million, so we are looking at a subset. And so there's just further analysis we have
Right.
to do with Epcor. And with respect to the wet ponds, we do agree with the Grant Thornton recommendation. We just have to get the service level agreements aligned.
The one other one that I'd flagged as well from the report is this whole governance question over planning, because it was one of the really, going back in history, it was one of the reasons why the transfer wasn't done 10 years ago or 15 years, 16 years ago now, was the feeling that planning was important for city to hold on to that, because where your pipes go, there goes your city to some extent. So if there's murkiness there, and I think that murkiness came up again in the debate over the direction of the sanitary sewer lines. I think that governance question came up there again. I'm wondering if it seems to me that there is certainly more work in terms of understanding that, even from this committee's point of view and from council's point of view, that would be useful to do and to think through and to have a look at. So I'm wondering if some kind of subsequent motion would be useful, or even just a memo about where we're at on that, because I think clarity from council's point of view would be helpful. Clearly would be helpful for your guys' point of view. And I'm wondering if we are going to be looking at that whole question, whether or not it should take a kind of more formal route.
So Ms. Petron's on the line, and perhaps she could answer that.
Councillor Henderson, if the committee feels that would be helpful, we can certainly follow up with a memo to council with additional information.
Well, it's not, the memo may not, but if there's ongoing conversation here, and there are choices that can be made to clean this up, it strikes me that probably should, because it deals with governance, might want to be publicly discussed, right, or discussed at council. So I'm wondering if so there's no rush on this, but if you guys are going to be working on this, I'm just wondering if we need to report back on that process.
I think I'd echo what Ms. Petron said. I mean, they are working on it. They will be looking at the governance pieces, but if you feel that would be helpful to come back to council.
Well, I'm wondering if there's value in doing something more than a memo, that's all. Because a memo doesn't really create the opportunity for any discussion here. Well, maybe we could start with a memo, so a motion actually that would get a memo back to us, I think. Do you need a motion to do that memo? You probably do.
We can prepare, take this feedback and prepare a memo without a motion.
Without a motion? Okay.
But if you, but if you prefer to,
No, that's
direct us
fine.
through a motion,
As
that's
long
fine
as it
too.
happens, I think it's a more complicated discussion, and I think, I think having it as, bring it up to the surface where there can be public input into it, I think is important at some point, but you guys need to do the work first. Great. I had one question for Grant Thornton in my dying second. How does and this may be hard to figure out, but if we'd used an efficiency factor instead of setting a target for efficiency, how would that have lined up? Do we know what the equivalent would have been with the efficiencies on drainage?
Yeah, I think, Ricky, we'd probably have to take that one away to dig into it a bit more rather than give an off-the-cuff response, Councillor Henderson.
Okay, all right. Well, then it's a little bit of an odd request. It may not be terribly useful. I just was more curious than anything else. Great, thanks. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
So, Councillor Walters, I think you were moving receipt of information. If there's no other questions.
Yeah, happy to. This. Thank you, everybody, for excellent presentations and all the work over the years to make this work very well.
Any further discussion? Please vote.
For the record, I really support the memo.
I don't think it's come up yet, or it hasn't on my computer. There it is.
Councillor Paquette, I think you just stated your vote verbally. Would you mind repeating it, please?
I'm a yes. I got the spinning wheel.
Thank you. And we have all the votes.
And display the vote. And that has passed. Oh, Councillor Banga was absent.
Is Councillor Banga advised that he was stepping out
Okay,
for a few
sorry.
minutes?
Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. Good. All right. Well, that brings us, there's so much for the preamble. This brings us to the main act. So at this point, I'm going to just walk us through the process that we're going to use to do these PBRs together. So just everything, all the rest of the Epcor items, so basically 6.3 to 6.8 are now all cross-referenced and will all be part of this next process. So at today's utility committee meeting, we'll be reviewing applications by Epcor Water Services, Inc. To establish performance-based rates for water, wastewater, and drainage services. The process for reviewing these applications, as approved by City Council on May 17th, 2021, is as follows. Epcor will present an opening statement and an overview of the application. Administration will present the reasonableness review report and a summary of written submissions filed by interested parties. The utility advisor, Mr. Beckett, will present his rate application review report. Following the report from the utility advisor, public speakers will be heard in panels. I think we only have two, so I think it will be one panel. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to make their remarks. Councillors will then have an opportunity to ask questions of the panel for a maximum of 5 minutes. Multiple rounds of questions are permitted. Once questions of the speakers have concluded, the utility advisor has 20 minutes to ask questions of Epcor. After Mr. Beckett has completed his questions, Councillor may ask questions of Epcor, administration, and the utilities advisor. Again, each round of questions will be 5 minutes long with multiple rounds permitted. Once all questions from councillors have been asked, Epcor will have an opportunity to provide a final submission on key issues and respond to any new information that has arisen. And then finally, the utility committee may then make any motions necessary to deal with the item. They may include recommending council approval of applied for rates as set out in the proposed bylaws, recommending council approval of the applied rates for as set out in the proposed bylaws with amendments, directing administration to work with Epcor to provide further information, directing any further work within committee's authority and mandate. So those are the rules of engagement. And any questions about that from anybody, just from a process point of view before we go forward? Great. Then I think we will go to the beginning of that process. Epcor, our ears are all yours.
Great. It sort of feels like you've just shot the gun at the start of a marathon. Thank you very much. If we can go to the next slide. We have in the room today Martin from Public and Government Affairs, Daryl and Carmen from Regulatory, Sean from Water, and myself, Amanda, from Drainage. On the next, oh, sorry, you're already on that slide. That's good. Sorry, if you could go back. Thank you. In addition, we have a wealth of expertise of people who are registered to speak but are not here in person. Those resources are available to answer questions as needed. And from a logistics perspective, I think as questions arise, you know, we can direct them to those resources and they can unmute themselves to speak as necessary. On the next slide, in this presentation today, I'm going to go through an overview of the PBR application and the result of this application on the revenue requirement and rates. Martin will talk about some public engagement outcomes. Daryl will talk about your favorite topic of risk allocation and return on equity, and then Sean is going to close us out with some comments on the administration report and a summary of some of the amendments and actions. So if we move on, with that introduction, I think we can just jump right in on the next slide. Thank you. So we have 3 regulatory applications in front of you today, one for water, one for wastewater treatment, and one for drainage, simply because the rate approvals for all 3 expired at the same time. And we do recognize that this was a large volume of information, and as discussed with Utility Committee previously, we also recognize the desire to stagger the timing of these applications in the future. And that's why we're here today proposing a 5-year term for water, and on a one-time basis, we're proposing a 3-year term for wastewater treatment. Sorry, I may have just said that wrong. A 5-year term for water, and on a one-time basis, a 3-year term for wastewater treatment and drainage. We do anticipate that once we achieve that staggering of the expiry dates, that we will continue with 5-year PBRs for all 3 utilities in the future. On the next slide, getting into the, some of the guiding objectives of a PBR structure, we believe that history has shown that the PBR structure has done a really great job of delivering value to customers through these guiding objectives. The application is prepared to include activities that are needed to continue to provide the safe and reliable utility service that our customers have come to expect. Utilities are incented to reduce costs, but the service levels with the performance penalties remove the incentive for the utility to save money by sacrificing service provided to customers. If we go to the next slide, we believe that because of the structure, that the needs of the utility and the customer are very well balanced. And the PBR also reduces the cost of the regulatory activities that can be high under some other structures and that customers do ultimately end up paying for. The utility is incented to find efficiencies, and we believe that the PBRs for water and wastewater treatment have been very effective in achieving these benefits. Over the last couple of PBR periods, Epcor has achieved $82 million in cost savings. And just as a reminder, as we've touched on here, when permanent cost savings are found in one PBR term, those savings are passed on to customers by building them into lower cost forecasts within the next PBR term. So the PBR structure provides, kind of a short-term benefit to the utility when you find efficiencies, but then a longer-term benefit to customers. On the next slide, within the PBR application, and this goes a little bit to Councillor Walter's comments earlier, we have incorporated additional efficiencies in addition to what we would achieve through the efficiency factor. So the cost forecast does include that. With that, operating costs have been kept to an increase of 1% a year over the next 3 years. And some people are predicting that we may be entering into a period of high inflation, and the PBR structure gives rate certainty to customers because any of those cost increases are borne by Epcor, including the higher interest charges that tend to go along with that. On the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, it seems like we may have gotten out. Yes, there we go. Thank you. The application also includes a significant investment in projects to maintain the condition of the infrastructure. In fact, 50% of the capital investment is directed towards maintaining reliable service, and that's 50% of the $1.35 billion of investment that's included in the applications. The remainder of the capital is related to projects contained within the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan, the Corrosion and Odor Reduction Plan, and Support for Growth. There were a lot of details on this capital investment that were included in the PBR application, and they're also summarized in the reader's guide that accompanied the application. If we could go to the next slide, please. In preparing the PBR applications, Epcor carefully considered the need for capital and operating expenditures, continued to provide that reliable service. But then we also balance that with the recognition that we know economic times are tough for a lot of people. As outlined in the PBR Reader's Guide, this was done by prioritizing requirements across the entire water cycle to direct funds to the areas of higher risk. If we go to the next slide, this picture that's on this slide shows a failure that occurred last year in drainage infrastructure. And this is a great example of the type of failure that we are aiming to avoid through this risk-based prioritization. So the risks are assessed based on a combination of the likelihood that an asset will fail in the near term, as well as the consequence of what would happen if a failure occurred. So the drainage assets, like the one shown in this picture, that are in very poor shape would score high on the likelihood of failure. Whereas projects that protect the water treatment plants from river flooding, those ones would score high in terms of some pretty catastrophic consequences if it were to occur. So this is the approach that we took in the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan, and we've continued that approach in planning the capital within these PBR applications. If we go to the next slide, the application does forecast economic recovery, which is also combined and offset by a slow decline in per capita water consumption, similar to what we've seen over the past number of years. In addition, a voluntary rate discount has been applied to make the increases more affordable, recognizing that the economic recovery will take some time. If we go to the next slide, we're now going to talk about how that impacts rates. If we could go one more slide, please. So if we do a bill comparison for residential customers between 2021 and 2022, the bill would increase by $4.22 per month. Of that, $3.42 of the increase is related to capital and operating activities for the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan and the Corrosion and Odor Reduction Strategy, with a 73-cent per month increase due to increased operating costs. There are a number of other changes, but in total they have no net impact on costs. This is just the increase from 2021 to 2022, and obviously the cost increases will be lower in the following years. I should point out that there's the additional charge that we've touched on here today related to a transfer of some charges that were previously paid by taxes and are now going to be included in the utility bill, but they haven't been included in this analysis because they should be cost neutral to customers. It's just a transfer. That was something that Utility Committee approved earlier this year. On the next slide, information is provided in the application as well as in the Reader's Guide on the bill impact to commercial customers. And I think it's important to remember that the bill for commercial customers is highly impacted by consumption, And in the application, we are forecasting about a 7% increase in commercial consumption. So, you know, we recognize also that there's a wide range of businesses within that category of commercial customers, and this is the average. So obviously, it'll impact different customers differently depending on how much their consumption increases. If we go to the next slide. Within the application, we've pursued every opportunity to keep the rate increases low through implementing the efficiency initiatives and prioritizing capital across the water cycle. As we've said, we do recognize, however, that we're in some difficult economic times and many of our customers are feeling the impact of that. As a result, in the application, Epcor is proposing a voluntary reduction in the customer bills in the front end of the PBR to support economic and social recovery. Recognizing that drainage is currently not achieving its return on equity, the application phases in the gradual increase in ROE over the next 5 years. So the full ROE won't actually be achieved even at the end of this PBR period. And the result of all of this is $66 million less being paid by customers in this PBR period than they otherwise would have paid. If we go to the next slide. So just in summary, these are some of the key points from the application that we'd like to highlight. We believe that the PBR has been successful and has incented the implementation of efficiencies. We believe that the approach to risk-based planning of our work has provided a great deal of benefit to customers, with the result being an average bill increase less than $1 per month. It's actually 73 cents per month. The application continues to provide funding for the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan and Corrosion and Odor Reduction program at a cost of $3.42 per month, and with the $66 million voluntary discount, in addition to the other cost mitigation efforts, we believe the result is customer costs that remain affordable, predictable, and stable. So with that, I will turn it over to Martin to talk about public engagement.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you, Councillor Henderson and Utility Committee. If we go to the next slide, I want to tell you about the process we used as the PBR applications were developed, where we sought and incorporated community input at various stages in line with the public engagement plan that we reviewed with Utility Committee in October of 2020. Nearly 1,900 people provided feedback through this process, and we met for in-depth conversations with 88 representatives of community organizations, including large and mid-sized customers, infill and traditional developers, housing supports not-for-profit, community leagues, citizen and expert advisory panels, and Treaty 6 and Métis Nation representatives. The engagement report is found at Appendix K of the application. Major findings from the engagement included widespread support for investing in utility reliability, a willingness to pay for those investments now rather than letting infrastructure deficits build up, and a strong alignment between community values and the performance areas that you hold the water cycle utilities accountable to. Digging in deeper, our analysis found a consensus that bill changes for residential customers of $7 to $10 a month would be supported, a level I'd note that is significantly higher than the actual $4 change proposed in the applications when you look at them all together. There are also other specific programs that were influenced by our consultations. For example, the expansion of funding to support infill development, and our greater understanding of the desire from builders that we find ways to improve their customer experience as they develop, and the incorporation of plans for flood prevention, corrosion and odor, and the Gold Bar long-term plan that were themselves rooted in in-depth engagement leading up to the application. If we go to the next slide, this summarizes in the engagement report the 4 areas that we sought input for. Stakeholder values, which guided the development of our plans for the utilities. Performance priorities, to understand if we were measuring what mattered most to customers and whether the performance levels matched their expectations as well. And trade-offs between investing now or investing later, the extent to which stakeholders were comfortable with the risk of asset failures, and preferences for future investment levels. And if we go to the next slide, I'll close by highlighting the recommendation in the applications that there be some small shifts in the weighting of the performance metrics you hold us accountable to. The individual metrics will not change, But what we found through the work was that the high priority stakeholders placed on some topics, such as water safety and system reliability, merited small increases in the weightings for each of those items. I'll now pass our presentation to Daryl to discuss risk allocation and how the risk premium for return on equity is calculated in the application.
Thanks, Martin. Next slide, please. We'll start with the Fair Return Standard. The Fair Return Standard is one of the foundational principles of rate regulation and has been established through both regulatory and legal proceedings. Effectively, it establishes that a utility has to be provided an opportunity to earn a fair return. What constitutes a fair return is based on three considerations. First, it enables the financial integrity of the utility to be maintained. Second, it permits incremental capital to be obtained at reasonable terms and conditions. Capital is necessary to fund a new infrastructure, and any failure to obtain capital at reasonable rates impacts ratepayers through higher debt costs. And the third consideration, the fair return must be comparable to the return available from capital invested in other enterprises of like risk. Lenders look to the overall profitability of an organization to ensure that they can repay any of the funds that are lent to them. So all three factors are considered. The Fair Return Standard has been accepted by the AUC and is also defined within the Epcor Edmonton Regulated Utilities Bylaw as one of the guiding objectives. Next slide, please. Just looking back to the 2017 to the 2021 PBR application, we believe that there was general alignment from our external cost of capital expert as well as Grant Thornton, the city experts. And we view that their opinions coalesced around two major points. First, EWSI's risks are greater than the average Alberta electric gas utility regulated by the AUC. We note that there were some differences in opinion of whether those risks derive from the business itself or from difference in the regulatory structure that addresses some of the risk in the business. The second point that they agreed on is that it is reasonable to add a risk premium to the AUC's generic cost of capital in determining an appropriate ROE for Epcor. Grant Thornton provided a range of appropriate returns, which we equate to a risk premium of between 1.5 and 2.1, with an average being 1.83. The city awarded a return of 1.175 based on a generic return of 8.5%, which equates to a risk premium of 1.675%. We remain of the position that we are exposed to significantly greater risks than the average electric and gas utility regulated by the Alberta Utilities Commission, and we note that these risks vary by utility. We also submit to the committee that there is no evidence presented to suggest that EWSI's business risk has declined since 2016. In fact, we would argue that with the addition of drainage, it's in fact increased. Next slide, please. In the next section, I'll just walk through a few of the risk factors that we believe make our utilities more risky than the AUC-regulated gas and electric. The first is product creation. The water utility is vertically integrated, covering all aspects of the delivery chain to the customer. Unlike gas and electric utilities, we must produce the product rather than purchasing it from another party. This requires raw water to be sourced and any variation in the raw river water quality addressed. As a result, there's substantial capital and operating risk associated with the treatment phase. Natural gas and electric utilities do not create the product, and production costs are flowed through to customers. Next slide, please. Thank you. Turning to public health. Unlike other utility products, only water is ingested by the end user. As a result, it requires an extremely precise level of quality and precision in all activities to maintain the expected standard. If there is any kind of system or human failure, the range of possible outcomes go from boil water advisories to health issues. Operations are also made more complex by the raw river water quality, which can be extremely variable. These two factors together result in high operational and reputational risk for us. In effect, It's the risk of a highly variable input and the requirement for a consistent output. Systems and operations also have to be ready to deal with the worst-case scenario, not the average, as their water quality can change quite quickly. While this speaks to water, we also note that EWSI bears the risks associated with the collection and treatment of wastewater, which has significant health and safety concerns for the public and our employees, given its nature. Somewhat related to the public health risk is health and environment regulation. All utilities are dealing with increased environment regulations. Water faces the additional complications and risks of dealing with public health regulations as well. Changing regulations often require modifications to operational processes or additional infrastructure in order to meet those new requirements. Non-routine adjustment address some of these risks, such as the recent NRA to address changes in the allowable lead concentrations in water. We qualified under this provision of the bylaw based on changes of law, as well as passing the financial threshold that applies to any non-routine adjustment. We continue to bear the risk of any change below the financial threshold of the NRA, which typically requires a capital investment of between $17 and $23 million in order to exceed the financial threshold. Anything below that is borne by the utility. An example of where this has happened in the past: Environment Canada's regulation prohibiting chlorinated discharge to any water body containing fish compelled us to build a dechlorination system for water treatment plants and to implement dechlorination procedures for water releases. No NRA was applied for because we did not meet the financial threshold, and the costs were borne by EWSI. Next slide, please. Moving to contributed assets. Contributed assets are assets funded by third parties, typically developers, who turn over ownership to us at commissioning. We are not permitted to earn a return on contributed assets. They'd have the responsibility to operate and maintain them at the same level as any other asset, including repair and replacement if they fail prematurely. Higher levels of contributed assets increase the operating leverage risk of the organization. Operating leverage risk derives from the balance of assets you earn a return on versus assets where you don't earn a return, implying higher levels of contributed assets lead to higher levels of risk. The AUC, in its 2011 generic cost of capital decision, recognized that without an increase in equity, higher levels of contributed assets would cause an increase in financial risk and operating leverage risk. When you compare EWSI utilities to the AUC, we're currently sitting at 53% of our asset component as contributed. In comparison, the average of the Alberta electric and gas utilities is 15%. As a result, we bear greater risk as the level of contributed assets is significantly higher than that for the gas and electric utilities regulated by the AUC. Next slide, please. Turning to asset life. Asset life is the time period over which you recover funds used to acquire the asset. All other things being equal, the longer the asset life, the greater the risk to that recovery, simply because there's more opportunity to be impacted by change, whether that's political, environmental, technological, or regulatory. There's also greater likelihood that the asset will fail or become obsolete prior to the end of its expected life. The impact of time on risk is not unique to utilities. In financial markets, the connection between capital recovery periods and risk is evident, because investors typically demand higher yields on long-term bonds compared to medium or short-term bonds from the same issuer. If you look at the composite life comparison between EWSI utilities versus the AUC, EWSI's composite life averages 57 years, where the AUC is 33 years. So as a result, the capital recovery risks faced by EWSI are greater than those of the electric and gas utilities, given the longer time period over which capital is recovered. The second risk factor on this slide is revenue forecast risk. All utilities are subject to variation in consumption and demand. For water, we are subject to considerable short-term variation, particularly in the summer months where weather patterns impact outdoor use, as well as from the longer-term decline on a per capita basis from conservation, efficient appliances, and other factors. Different regulatory regimes allow different rate structures to address these variations. Our rate structure is comprised of a very high portion of volumetric rates and a very low portion of fixed rates, indicating that revenue fluctuates with changes in consumption. Gas and electric utilities regulated by the AUC have a much lower percentage of volumetric rates and higher fixed rates, implying that their revenues fluctuate much less for the same change in consumption. Gas utilities also have additional mechanisms to address variations, including revenue cap structure and weather deferrals. When you compare the percentage of revenue from fixed charges, EWSI utilities average 31%, where the AUC utilities are more than double at 72%. EWSI bears risk as the lower portion of revenues arising from fixed charges, the greater the risk that forecast revenues will fail to materialize. Next slide, please. In proposing an ROE for the current application, we recognize that traditional methods of estimating cost of capital were problematic due to the turmoil in financial markets caused by the global pandemic. Instead, we've proposed what we feel is a very straightforward update of the Grant Thornton 2016 ROE analysis, which underpinned the 2017 to 2021 award, and we've updated that with 2019 pre-pandemic data. You can see on the right-hand side the chart, the way the buildup would work is we take the current AUC generic at 8.5%, and we add the risk premium as we've interpreted it from the Grant Thornton report in 2016, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the average of the 1.54 to the 2.12, so that's 1.83. And then we've reduced that for the change in bond yields that have happened since the 2016 time period. And just a side note, that number has decreased considerably since we've done this. It would be in the range right now of 0.15 or 0, but nevertheless we've had 0.3, which yields a 9.95 proposed ROE. We believe this is the right approach given the impact of the pandemic and the turmoil it has caused in financial markets. But more importantly, it's also aligned with Utility Committee's direction to use the AUC generic as the starting point in determining the proposed ROE. It also represents a reduction in the risk premium to 1.45, which is the 1.83 less the 0.38, from the current 1.675. Next slide, please. As stated earlier, to moderate rate increases, we have proposed a ramp up the ROE for drainage base operations. Base, in this context, refer to everything except SERP and core. We'd ramp up the ROE over a 5-year period, which effectively means we would start at 5.5% in 2022, and we'd only reach the proposed 9.5% in 2026. That's how we derive the $66 million economic recovery rebates that we've spoken to for ratepayers. That amounts to $5.21 monthly discount in 2022 for the average residential customer. On the other side, this rebate is funded by EWSI foregoing income that we would normally earn and equates to a 28% reduction over the 3-year period for drainage. If you look at the average of the escalating ROEs, because again, it starts low and moves higher over the course of 5 years, this results in a 3-year average of 8.51%. So that's what we'd actually be earning as opposed to the proposed 9.95. And with that, I will turn it over to Sean.
Thank you, Darrell, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to spend just a few minutes providing some thoughts that we had on administration reports. If we could go to the next slide, please. First off, I think Epcor wants to thank administration. This has not been an easy lift. This has been a tremendous amount of work for all of us, and we're very happy with the level of commitment we've seen from administration, and we had some really good conversations as we worked together to get these applications filed. We believe that the administration reports are very comprehensive in nature, and we have carefully evaluated each of the ideas and items that the city administration has brought forward for consideration today. Those include things like shifting in risk, and that's potential impact to customer rates, further reductions to our return on equity, and some changes to the special rate adjustments and the non-routine adjustments. Next slide, please. We think it's important, though, that we put these items in context, certainly as you look at the entirety of our application, but most importantly, in relation to the existing PBR process and framework. Again, it's important to note that we have voluntarily reduced our returns, saving customers $66 million, realizing an earned ROE of about 8.5%. And if you look at the additional items that administration has brought forward, if those were to be implemented, that would reduce our revenues by an additional $40 million. And the concern we have is the cumulative effect that that has on our ability to earn a fair return on the investment that we're making. But most importantly, it could put our credit rating at risk, which could ultimately result in higher debt cost for customers. Next slide, please. Now, that being said, we do support making some amendments to the application, and we'll share those thoughts in a few minutes, but they'll focus around reimbursement of operating costs that were capitalized during the PBR term. We're going to propose a further reduction to our return on equity and also a reduction on the debt costs that are currently paid by customers. Next slide. We also support commissioning a deferral account study to better inform future PBR designs for the next cycle. We have serious reservations about introducing a consumption deferral account, both in its substance and timing, given the late stage of the PBR process. We agree with administration that this is a complex subject, but we firmly believe it merits in-depth review. And when we start to talk about the shifting of risks to customers, we think it's important that we hear from our constituents and better understand what their risk tolerance is, and we think that they need to be involved in this conversation. Next slide, please. We also believe, as Amanda mentioned, that our one water approach, looking at risk-based capital replacements, achieves significant benefits not only to system reliability, but also it mitigates impacts to the customer's cost. Now, we are aware that city administration is concerned of the level of funding that we've included in our PBR applications to help coordinate city-initiated work or neighborhood renewal programs, and we believe there's a path forward today that we may be able to help close that gap if the utility committee agrees that additional funding is necessary. Next slide, please. It's important to note, though, that we do not support making any type of retroactive changes to the non-routine adjustments or the special rate adjustments. We think the PBR bylaw is clear that the utility must manage its cost. We bear those risks. Some programs, at the end of the day, will cost more, and some programs may have less investment than was planned. And I think we believe that the PBR process provides that balance that allows us to optimize spending over a PBR term to mitigate impacts to customers' rates. And any type of true-up or adjustments, in our opinion, should be prospective in nature and not retroactive. And they certainly need to be symmetrical in nature. We can't get into the position where we try to pick winners and losers. It's important that we look at things at a level of symmetry. Next slide, please. We also feel that additional changes are not warranted on a further reduction to return on equity or the efficiency factors that have been recommended by administration. We think the cumulative impact of a further reduction of 0.15 on our ROE, given the fact that we'll be earning 8.5% over the next 3 years, and an increase in the drainage efficiency factor from 0.25 to 0.5 will be significant. And we do not see any link to a type of risk analysis or operational opportunity. Again, our concern is that our ability to continue to obtain low-cost financing could be put at risk if our returns and our earnings are continued to be driven down further. Next slide, please. We also feel that the next slide, one more slide, I think. There we go. Thank you. We also feel that the evidence does not support any type of changes to in-service dates or additional rate smoothing. As it relates to the Orem facility, the construction on that project will be completed this year. Staff is going to move in immediately upon completion, and we feel that IFRS guidance is clear that the depreciation should begin when an asset is available for use. And then as it relates to rate smoothing, as noted, the transfer of fire protection cost from property tax bills to the utility bills do lead to a one-time increase in 2022. But we feel that there is offsetting reductions to property tax revenue that, in our opinion, will make this change net neutral to property owners. Next slide. Now I'm just going to speak a minute about some proposed amendments and actions. One more slide, please. So in addition to the $66 million reduction that we're seeking approval for, we would ask Utility Committee to direct that we file compliance filings to further reduce our revenue by $5.2 million, and that's related to the capitalization of valve casings and service box replacements, and this was a recommendation that comes from administration. We also ask that we further reduce our revenue by $3.7 million to account for the changing cost associated with debt that was also identified by administration. We're also asking that we further reduce our ROE from 9.95 down to 9.89. And this, again, is still based on the AUC generic cost of capital at 8.5%, plus a recalculation of the Grant Thornton risk premium. And this adjustment would save customers an additional $2 million over the next 3 years. And then we believe if City Administration and the Utility Committee are concerned with the level of funding that we have included in our PBR applications for city-initiated work, there's an opportunity to require Epcor to include additional funding into our capital program to close any perceived gaps. Next slide, please. We also ask that the Utility Committee allow us to affirm and include in our final filing the Edmonton Economic Recovery Rebate, which does temporarily reduce our return on equity and saves customers the $66 million that we've discussed earlier. I do think it's important to note, though, as we move through today's proceedings, the size and timing of the discount may need to be reevaluated if there's additional material reductions to our returns, and that's to ensure that the cumulative impact of these changes do not limit our ability to obtain low-cost financing. We do currently carry an A low credit rating, which does benefit customers with low cost of debt. Next slide, please. We also ask that the Utility Committee direct in a separate motion that administration and Epcor work together on the study of consumption deferral accounts, most importantly to include public and customer engagement to understand their risk tolerance and report these findings back to Utility Committee prior to the initiation of the next PBR rate cycle, which is about 3 years away. Next slide. And just in closing, it's important to note that administration in their review found our applications were reasonable and that the PBR framework benefits customers. We continue to believe that the PBR framework is effective. It provides a strong incentive for Epcor to reduce customer costs. It maintains rate stability and predictability for our customers, and it provides the company an opportunity to earn a fair rate of return. We believe that the application is reasonable. When you boil all this down, we think we're looking at a moderate increase to continue to provide safe, reliable service, including the funding of future flood protection programs, the continuation of SERP and odor, and it protects our customer from and it allows us to provide safe, reliable service. It focuses capital where it's needed most. And just in closing, Epcor remains committed to working with the City and Utility Committee today to finalize the application and move this forward to Council consideration as quickly as practical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great summary, so thank you. I think administration's next with their report.
All right, well, good morning, members of Utility Committee, and of course, Mr. Beckett, who is joining you on the panel today, with Ms. Pearson and myself to assist with the presentation and answer any questions you have are members from Grant Thornton, who you've already met, in addition to Ms. Angie Brown, as well as the various members of administration, including Jeff Olson from our Utility Regulation Group and Ingrid Johnson from Law. Next slide, please. So the outline for today's presentation begins with an overall summary of our reasonableness review of the three applications. We'll then briefly touch on Epcor's written response to administration's review, but the focus of the presentation today is going to be on four key regulatory issues. I'll be discussing the first three regarding non-routine adjustments, the water consumption forecast, and the efficiency factor, with Grant Thornton summarizing their findings regarding the return on equity. And then finally, we'll briefly touch on a few items that administration has highlighted for future consideration. Next slide, please. So beginning with our overall conclusions of the three applications, the PBR framework proposed by Epcor is consistent with the approach that's been used for a number of years now, and we consider that this framework continues to work as intended. We also consider that on an overall basis, the three applications are reasonable. Epcor has provided a comprehensive amount of information in the applications, along with providing answers to a number of questions from administration, the utility advisor, and counselors, and we certainly thank Epcor for their cooperation and flexibility in sharing information and getting us to where we are today. But notwithstanding our overall conclusions, there are a number of regulatory items that we did highlight in our report for Utility Committee and Council's consideration. Next slide, please. So Epcor provided a written response to the reviews completed by administration and the utility advisor, and as Mr. Bradford just mentioned, they proposed to reduce the rate applications by $3.7 million for debt costs, $5.2 million for the accounting treatment of valve casings, as well as to adjust the proposed ROE from 9.95% to 9.89%. These proposed reductions, along with certain other points raised in Epcor's written response, address a number of the concerns identified by administration. And although administration is not in complete agreement with certain other positions taken by Epcor in the response, we're going to focus on four outstanding regulatory issues that administration considers significant. And these four issues don't include any other matters the Utility Committee, Utility Advisor, or Epcor may wish to address, such as public submissions, performance metrics, or adequate funding for city-initiated capital projects. Next slide, please. So the first item is the regulatory treatment of non-routine adjustments and how they fit into the overall PBR methodology of I-X. So please bear with me. There's about 3 or 4 slides here, and it's just something administration feels quite strongly about. So we're going to try and walk through this a little more slowly. So under PBR, customer rates are increased annually by an inflation factor less an efficiency factor that the utility is expected to achieve annually. The revenue from these customer rates are intended to cover the ongoing operating capital costs of the utility, as well as to provide a reasonable margin of profit. However, on occasion, very unusual events occur that were not envisioned when rates were approved, that are material in size and outside the control of the utility. Therefore, in fairness to the utility, additional funding is provided outside of the PBR I-X formula to cover these unusual events. For Epcor Water Services, Inc., this additional funding is called a non-routine adjustment. Next slide, please. The Alberta Utilities Commission also implemented PBR for certain gas and electric utilities in Alberta beginning in 2013. In their decision 2012-237, the AUC laid out the overall methodology for how PBR would work. Similar to the Epcor PBR framework, customer rates are approved annually based on an I-X formula. And in limited circumstances, additional funding is provided for significant unforeseen events that are outside the control of the utility, such as for costs related to a major forest fire. The AUC refers to this funding as a Z factor rather than a non-routine adjustment. In decision 2012-237, the AUC emphasized that Z factors must be carefully defined and limited in scope since they are inconsistent with the PBR objectives and less than the efficiency incentives created by I-X. So just to clarify what this means is that under PBR, the regulator approves the costs and the revenue requirement customer rates on a forecast basis. The reason for this, it gives the utility an incentive to find efficiencies, spend less than the approved revenue requirement, and make more profit. And these efficiencies and savings are passed on to customers through lower rates in the next PBR term. However, on occasion, the regulator deems it necessary to approve the use of actual costs or deferral accounts and customer rates. And although a deferral account reduces the incentive for the utility to be efficient, it is implemented to protect the interests of either the utility and or customers where an item is material in size, outside the control of the company, and can't be reasonably forecasted. Next slide, please. So consistent with this, the AUC confirmed in decision 2012-237 that Z-factor funding for significant events that are outside the control of the utility must be based on the actual costs incurred by the utility and not the forecast costs. The reason being is the regulator needs to ensure that this one-time additional funding provided outside of I-X has in fact been prudently incurred by the utility. And the AUC's laid out a two-step process in order for the utility to receive the funding under Z-factor. The utility must first notify the AUC as soon as possible when an event has occurred that may give rise to a Z-factor. And then the utility files an application to receive the funding for the Z-factor once all the costs associated with the event have been incurred or the savings have been realized that need to be passed on to customers. Next slide, please. So turning to the treatment of non-routine adjustments for Epcor, consistent with the approach used by the AUC, administration recommends that the utility committee clarify as part of the 22 to 26 rate applications that these non-routine adjustments are to be based on the actual costs incurred by Epcor. Administration also recommends a two-step approach be implemented whereby Epcor would receive interim approval and funding for the adjustment with a final true-up of funding being completed based on actual costs. With respect to the appropriate treatment for the 17 to 21 NRA's non-routine adjustments, administration has concerns with the significant forecast variances, which we'll discuss further on the next slide, including whether Epcor has added costs in 2022 to 26 rates that are already being funded through the 17 to 21 NRAs. Epcor has stated their understanding is that non-routine adjustments are based on forecast costs, and they have raised a number of concerns if actual costs were instead used, including retroactive rate making related to the 17 to 21 NRAs. Administration notes that the current bylaw 17698 and 18100 contain wording that refer to non-routine adjustments being charged to a deferral account based on actual costs if they are very significant in size. So administration is recommending that the utility committee either clarify that the 17 to 21 NRAs are to be based on actual costs for significant variances, or alternatively, that Epcor be directed to remove any costs included in the 22 to 26 rate applications that are already being funded by the 17 to 21 non-routine adjustments. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide on this, so thank you for bearing with me. So this slide shows the approved and forecast costs for the 2017 to 21 non-routine adjustments as provided by Epcor in response to administration's written question number 19. Administration has highlighted in blue the three non-routine adjustments with significant forecast variances that may warrant Epcor refunding a total of $5.2 million to customers once the actual costs are finalized at the end of March 22. As an example, for the lead mitigation strategy non-routine adjustment, Epcor stated that the forecast costs are $1.5 million in comparison to the approved funding of $3.4 million for 2017 to 21. Epcor also stated that the lower projected costs are primarily due to a delay from 2020 to 2022, when the construction would be completed for the phosphoric acid dosing facilities at both the Rossdale and E.L. Smith water treatment plants, with injection of the phosphoric acid beginning thereafter. Administration questions the fairness of Epcor receiving an additional $1.9 million of funding in 2017 to 21 as a result of a delay in the forecast construction of its own lead mitigation facilities, especially when Epcor had submitted to the Utility Committee in March 2019 that it required $3.4 million of extra funding to implement the lead mitigation strategy in order to comply with a new guideline for Canadian drinking water quality recently issued by Health Canada and the corresponding changes that will be implemented in Alberta. With respect to the drainage LRT relocations, Epcor is forecasting costs of $3.2 million in comparison to the approved funding of $5.3 million in 17 to 21, due in part to the City of Edmonton contractor delays. Administration questions whether some of these costs are included in the 2022 to 24 rate applications, even though Epcor already received funding through the 17 to 21 non-routine adjustment. Administration also notes that the Alberta Utility Commission issued a similar decision on July 29, 2019, in which it denied the request from NMAX Power Corporation for a Z-factor funding in the amount of $14.15 million for costs associated with the relocation of NMAX infrastructure resulting from the Green Line Light Rail Transit project. The AUC stated the reason it denied this Z-factor for NMAX's request was because the $14.15 million of requested funding was based on forecast rather than actual costs. Next slide, please. Okay, so quickly moving to two other issues. Water consumption forecast, the forecast for 2022 to 26. Administration is unable to obtain a reasonable level of comfort that the forecast is reasonable. Administration notes that over the past two PBR terms, there has been significant variance between forecast and actual water consumption due largely to weather. And now adding on to that, for this PBR term is the impact of COVID-19, which has further increased Epcor's use of judgment in forecasting water consumption for 22 to 26. Since administration couldn't get reasonable comfort that the forecasts were reasonable, we tried to come up with an alternative that would still work. So we recommended a proposal of maybe a deferral account be implemented for water consumption for 22 to 26, just so we get through the additional uncertainty created by COVID-19. Administration notes a similar weather deferral account was approved by AUC for ATCO Gas, who's also operating under performance-based regulation, in order to protect both ATCO Gas and customers from the impacts of weather on gas consumption. Next slide, please. So there's a few ways that a water consumption deferral account could be implemented for Epcor Water if Utility Committee and Council agreed. But the simplest method that administration would propose is for the initial customer rates for 22 to 26 be based on the forecast water consumption currently in Epcor's PBR applications. Epcor would then over or under collect on revenue each year based on the actual water consumption. Epcor would settle this over or under collection of revenue in the next year's rates by including an adjustment in the annual rate filing it submits to the city each year. The annual rate filing currently adjusts customer rates under the approved PBR formula for such things as inflation and the productivity factor. Next slide, please. So the third issue is the proposed efficiency factor, also known as the X factor. Epcor has proposed an efficiency factor of 0.25% for each of the three utilities, consistent with the factor approved during the 17 to 21 PBR term. Administration recommends the efficiency factor for drainage be increased to 0.5%, consistent with the efficiency factor used for water services when it initially operated under PBR in 2002 to 2006. Drainage services is currently transitioning to PBR following the transfer from the City of Edmonton in September 2017. Administration therefore considers it reasonable to expect additional efficiencies to be realized in drainage relative to the two other water and wastewater utilities that have been operating under PBR for a longer period of time. So with that, I will now turn it to the final issue, which is over to Grant Thornton to discuss the proposed return on equity. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Barry. So as noted, our comments today will be focused on the return on equity. We would note that EWSI did not undertake a formal cost of capital study, but instead updated the 2016 analysis. Our scope was focused on the reasonability of that work, as we've done in the past. It's important to note that we do not mean to establish a precedent for long-term risk premium or a long-term adjustment formula with the work we've done currently or in the past, but it's meant to test the reasonability of what's been proposed. Next slide, please. This slide provides a recap of the risk premium positions relative to AUC since 2017. You can see that EWSI initially proposed a risk premium of 2.2% in 2017. The Utility Committee allowed 1.675% risk premium at that time. EWSI has requested a premium of 1.45% in 2021, and as noted in their earlier presentation, they've reduced their requested risk premium to 1.39. For illustration purposes, we've also shown the impact of adding a further 25 basis point ROE reduction to the risk premium. We would want to note, though, overall, we do continue to support a risk premium over the AUC ROE based upon the current risk profile. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Angie Brown, who's going to speak to the EWSI risk factors.
Thanks, Troy. Can we just move to the next slide? Excellent. So on this slide, we're going to focus on the risk assessment portion of our review of the ROE. So since Epcor's already provided an overview of what each of these risk factors mean, I'm going to focus on the results of our review of those risk factors and provide some additional perspectives to consider. Overall, we agreed with Epcor's position regarding risk associated with water as a consumable product, including the unique health and environmental implications associated with providing a consumable product. We also agreed with EWSI's comments regarding interest rate risk being borne by EWSI, as opposed to passing that interest risk on to their customers. However, we would like to note that EWSI borrows through intercompany accounts with its parent company, and those accounts may not be immediately subject to the same market fluctuations. We also partially agreed with EWSI's comments regarding the volatility of variable demand. While the variable nature of revenues tied to consumption does increase risk, we did note that EWSI is trying to move towards more fixed rates in the water application, and there is a potential to mitigate this risk further should the Utility Committee decide to implement a consumption deferral account during this proceeding. We did not agree with EWSI's assessment of risk on capital recovery, the level of contributed assets, or the length of the approved ROE for the current PBR terms proposed. For capital recovery, we understand that EWSI's assets have a longer useful life than the assets that a gas or electric utility would hold. Therefore, the recovery of these costs happen over a longer period of time. However, we would also note that there are other mitigating considerations here. For example, holding the asset longer means the utility is able to generate a return on that asset for a longer period of time, which would partially offset any reduction in its annual depreciation expense. For contributed assets, we understand that EWSI has a significant amount of contributed assets that it is responsible for maintaining while they are unable to earn a return on that asset. However, we would like to remind the Utility Committee that any forecasted operating expenses associated with repairs and maintenance would be recovered through rates, and any future capital investments in those assets to extend their life or to add on to the contributed assets would also give the ability to earn a return to EWSI. The determination of ROE for the PBR term, so for 5 years for water in this case and 3 for wastewater and drainage, for that factor, we understand that Epcor's position is that locking into the ROE now for the duration of the 3 to 5 year PBR terms imposes risk in comparison to the more frequently updated AUC cost of capital reports. However, at this time, the AUC has only extended the generic cost of capital for 1 year as a temporary measure to address the current uncertainty being driven by COVID-19. Epcor could currently benefit from increased rate and revenue stability by locking into the longer ROE today for that extended PBR period. I'll hand it back to Troy now to provide some further comments on the overarching conclusions.
Thanks, Angie. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that there are two ways that EWSI is compensated for its incremental risks. First, it has more equity in its capital structure than the AUC utilities. Second, EWSI earns a risk premium over the AUC return on equity. These create two levers that the committee needs to consider when assessing the incremental risk. We've shared an illustrative example which shows the impact of changing these inputs on $1,000 of rate base. You can see that by adjusting to the AUC levels, it does reduce EWSI's earnings by 18.9%, illustrating that these are sensitive and material assumptions. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, Grant Thornton does agree that the EWSI has a higher risk profile than the utilities considered by the AUC. We see merit and simplicity in reducing the risk premium if the risk profile of EWSI is reduced. We also want to note that it is important to keep in mind the need to have a stable regulatory environment for all stakeholders. And I know that was touched upon in some of Epcor's comments. So therefore, we would agree with that, and we do recommend that there should be some caution in the pace of change. Specifically, we did want to state that we do believe a modest change to the return on equity would have merit if the committee sees a reduction in the EWSI risk profile or if additional risk mitigation is adopted, as was noted by the city. And with that, we'll turn it over to the next slide and back to the city.
All right, so this last slide. So finally, we have identified a few regulatory matters that should be addressed in preparation for the next rate applications to be submitted for drainage and wastewater treatment effective April 1, 2025. Specifically, administration recommends that the Utility Committee pass a motion that Epcor and administration work together to bring forward reports providing further background and the appropriate regulatory treatment for the following items: improved disclosure of changes in accounting and capitalization policies and treatment, reporting the size of the workforce including actual and forecast full-time equivalents, a review of how long-term debt interest rates are set for Epcor Water, and a further review of the performance measures to ensure they are increasingly stringent and challenging over time. So the one final thing I just wanted to touch on was the public submissions, as Councillor Henderson mentioned in the opening. So we did receive one written submission from the public, which was from Ms. Cheryl Lorenz, which I believe is registered to speak today. It has been included in report FCS 00627, and that has been also added into that is Epcor's written response to that submission. So with that, that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Beckett, I should just do a double check. I don't know if you have a rough idea of how much time you need, and usually I wouldn't worry about it, but unfortunately we've had to sneak another meeting in after this, and I wouldn't want to interrupt you. So we've got 10 minutes left. Do you think that's sufficient?
More than sufficient.
Great, perfect, then off you go.
I don't have a presentation to give, just a couple of comments. As has been noted, we've all identified issues with the rate of return that Epcor is requesting, and I'll be able to flesh that out when I'm given the opportunity to ask questions of Epcor. I also identified some items that were not addressed in Epcor's response. For instance, the number of business cases that did not contain alternatives to be considered. Epcor's response was that 16 of 17 drainage cases are for capital programs, and capital programs do not encourage NPV analysis. I disagree with that. One important issue that was also not addressed by Epcor was the role of utility management versus role of the regulator. In Epcor's application, they initiated a proposal on environmental leadership, and they described that as a decision that was reached internally. That's fine, and I don't really have a problem with the issue that they've identified, but I do have an issue with process. I believe that if management decides to set a new direction, adopt a new policy, create new leadership opportunities, that the utility committee should have overview of those kind of decisions, and that they shouldn't just be sprung on the utility committee in an application of this type, particularly when the applications are so voluminous. Things like that can tend to easily get lost. So those are my comments. As I said, I'll flesh out some of my other comments through the questions that I have for Epcor.
Thank you very much. Well, we have 7 minutes left. I think we would have time to hear from one speaker, but I'm wondering if it would make more sense to pick up with the speakers after lunch. Any thoughts from the committee?
Yeah,
That makes a lot of sense to me.
yeah. And
Okay.
considering it'll be our 7 minutes for lunch.
Yeah, I know.
Found time.
Okay, then my apologies to the two speakers. We will start up with you immediately after the lunch break at 1:30. Usually we could have probably snuck you in and gone a little bit late today, but we've had to sneak in a special council meeting that will be starting at 12:15. So I think we'd be playing with fire to start with you now, because there may be questions of you as well. So that being said, we will adjourn slightly early and reconvene at 1:30.